In the film 10 Days That Shook the World, director Sergei Eisenstein captured the spirit of a mass movement so crucial it affected every aspect of 20th century history, the Russian Revolution. The Russian monarchy collapsed. The victory belonged to the proletariat, led by Bolshevism's prophet, Vladimir Lenin. And Russia became a land of untouchables to Americans.
For 16 long years, a nation larger even than ours in population and in extent of territory has been unable to speak officially with the United States or to maintain normal relations with us.
American diplomatic recognition of the Soviet Union is a story of expediency at work in the field of foreign affairs. When Franklin Roosevelt assumed the presidency, his most urgent business was spurring life into the economy. Foreign trade was vital, Russia was a promising customer, so a deal was struck with what some would later call the devil.
They date their royal beginnings from the victory of Muscovy princes over Mongol tribesmen. They are the Romanovs, keepers of the royal treasures, the Tsars of Russia.
We're in the home of the late Mrs. Marjorie Meriwether Post, Hillwood in Washington. This is a cultural link with Imperial Tsarist Russia, perhaps the finest collection of Russian art outside the Soviet Union. This chandelier came from the palace of Tsar Paul I, the son of Catherine the Great. That's her portrait behind me. The other portraits include the Tsars Nicholas I and II, and the last Tsarina Alexander. That was pre-revolutionary Russia before 1917. The United States did not recognize the new regime for 16 years.
In January 1917, Tsar Nicholas played the role of field commander to the army in spite of warnings of dangerous unrest throughout Russia. His army held the key to the outcome of the First World War.
To the Allies, victory depended on the Russians holding the Eastern Front, however exhausted and demoralized.
The German High Command devised an ingenious scheme to undermine the Russian war effort. One man would galvanize the revolution and persuade the Russian army to lay down its arms. Russia's most powerful revolutionary, Lenin, waited in exile for his moment.
We thought that the Russian Revolution would help the Germans in their war against us, which indeed is what the Germans thought, and that's why the Germans put Lenin into Russia. You know, Lenin was living in Switzerland. The German army took him and put him on the train and ran a special train through Helsinki and into Leningrad, you know, St. Petersburg as it then was, believing Lenin would know how to organize and touch off the Russian Revolution, which would help the Germans in their war against us and injure us. In a short view, it was quite logical.
It was the most important train ride in history. In a few months, Lenin would ignite the Bolshevik Revolution and become dictator of the world's first communist government. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or Lenin, passionate, ruthless, possessed. He used his brilliant mind and the power of the spoken word to control other men. His goals were to destroy the capitalist system and create a classless society, beliefs based on the doctrines of German philosopher Karl Marx. Lenin's first official act was to withdraw Russia from the war. Leon Trotsky, the second most powerful man in the Soviet Union. The leader of the Red Army was sent to Brest-Litovsk for peace talks. The German General Staff would exact a humiliating peace, demanding annexation of Poland, Lithuania, vast areas of the Ukraine, and a staggering indemnity. Trotsky was against signing the harsh peace treaty, but Lenin capitulated in order to save the revolution. American troops arrived in Murmansk to serve under British command, guarding valuable military supplies. President Wilson had refused Allied pleas for intervention on the Eastern Front. The Murmansk expedition was all that he would allow. The British, however, skirmished against Bolshevik troops, and Wilson realized he had made a mistake.
We didn't want to do it at all. We were really pressed into it by our allies. Wilson would never have agreed to the intervention, to the use of American troops in North Russia, had he not been formally requested by the commander-in-chief on the Western Front that we send those troops there, and assured that this would be of great value from the standpoint of our operations against Germany. He sent them there thinking that this would play a role in the war. It didn't, but he didn't know that.
The United States also intervened in Siberia, ostensibly to protect the huge accumulation of war supplies from the Bolsheviks. Among the international contingent were 7,000 Japanese troops. Their real motive was to strengthen Japan's foothold on the Asian mainland.
The British and the French had been urging us for 6 months to send forces there, and Wilson had been resisting it. And he finally yielded to this because there was a large contingent of Czechoslovak troops trying to withdraw from Russia through the Far East, and Wilson got the impression that we could be of assistance to these troops in getting out of Siberia, making their exit. And it was really this which tipped him over and caused him to assent to this. He had, unfortunately, a very poor idea of what was in the works in the Far East. And this played no part in getting the Czechs out. What it did was to give the Soviet propagandists good reason for 60 years to come for claiming that we had initiated a hostile act against the Soviet government.
The Red Scare reached America in 1919 when bombs went off in the streets. Capitalism's bastion was defiled when a blinding explosion rocked New York's financial district at lunchtime. 16 bombs were discovered in the New York post office, all destined for anti-Bolshevist government officials. The mail became a terrorist weapon. The most arrogant attack was the bombing of Attorney General Mitchell Palmer's home in Washington. Palmer would soon make use of the fear and hysteria that gripped America.
After World War I, people had the impression that radical views, radical leftist, Marxist, communist, socialist views were being carried into our society by immigrant elements. The image of the Bolshevik agitator at that time was that of a bearded anarchist from Italy or goodness knows where, but not a real American. In other words, this was a foreign phenomenon that was brought into our midst, and people took excitement from this and opposed it in very stupid and silly ways.
The Palmer roundups began in November 1919. All suspected communists were corralled for mass deportation to the Soviet Union. Since the Senate had rejected the Versailles Peace Treaty, we were technically still at war, and Palmer used the Wartime Sedition Act to deport aliens accused of anarchism. The Justice Department formed a special anti-radical intelligence division and named young J. Edgar Hoover to run it. He ran it efficiently. The hysteria reached its peak when the 5 socialist members of the New York State Assembly were voted out of office as traitors. Anarchist Emma Goldman, nicknamed the Red Queen, and Alexander Berkman, the Red King, were the big catches. They were among 249 deportees herded on the good ship Buford in 1919 and shipped to the Soviet Union. The press had a field day, calling it the unholiest cargo that ever left our shores.
Well, actually, the activities against which people were reacting in this Red Scare, most of them were anarchist activities, not communist. anarchist activities of which the Bolsheviki in Russia did not approve at all. They, of course, were making their own efforts all during the 1920s and in part in the 1930s to build up a communist party in this country, and they conceived of it as a revolutionary party. Had it had sufficient success, it would have tried to seize power. So there was a certain legitimate cause for complaint on the American side.
The Soviet Union, indeed the entire communist world, went into a state of shock on January 21st, 1924, the day Lenin died. The death of Lenin plunged Russia into the stupor of grief. Under gray skies, falling snow, bitter winds, the body of Lenin was carried to the House of Trade Unions. Countless thousands of mourners came to view the body. A banner proclaimed, "Lenin is dead, his work lives on." All of Russia observed a moment of silent mourning. At the corners of the casket stood members of the Central Committee, among the most famous, the bearded Kalinin. Other mourners included a young Georgian officer named Stalin. The brutal, paranoid Stalin rose to power by eliminating all opposition. In his early years, Stalin was involved in the criminal activities of the party. He ascended mysteriously from obscurity to the Central Committee. In Professor Kennan's words, Stalin was a master of political intrigue, a man without pity or mercy. Trotsky, who charged that Stalin had poisoned Lenin, was the main obstacle to Stalin. By 1927, Trotsky was expelled from the party and hounded across Europe into permanent exile. Trotsky finally fled to Mexico, but in 1940, Stalin's assassins murdered him. Russia's peasant farm owners, the kulaks, became Stalin's next victims. His first 5-year plan forced millions of peasants onto collective farms. Resistors were killed. Nearly 3 million people are thought to have died. The industrialization program forced other millions into labor camps. The workers were used to build dams, railroads, power plants, and factories. In order to meet the goals set by the 5-year plan, Russia would have to import on a gigantic scale. America was the logical trading partner. But the booming American economy of the late 20s did not need Russian trade. Later in the Depression, it would. Despite the lure of trade, Russia remained anathema to the U.S. Diplomatic recognition was withheld. Russia's Bolshevik philosophy ran against the American grain. We were the only nation to isolate Russia from normal diplomatic relations. Stalin's orders to the Comintern, the Communist International, were to incite revolution in every capitalist society. America was a prime target for agitation.
Soviet government was never willing to give up the propaganda entirely or to disown the Comintern. It couldn't. I mean, the Comintern was part and parcel of it. The so-called Comintern activities in this country, the efforts to create a communist faction in the United States, they were what you might call the old classical pattern. They were aimed at finding workers, of creating a sort of a communist workers movement. They aimed at the lowest levels of the social structure. Of course, many people were deeply shocked by the declared intention of the Soviet leaders to promote revolutions in other countries. To Americans in particular, who conceived this to be a democratic country, this was very shocking because they thought, why should you try to overthrow by force, in the interests of a tiny minority, a country which has its own facilities for choosing its government?
Pressures on the United States to recognize the Soviet Union increased. British playwright George Bernard Shaw propagandized for Russia in a broadcast to America.
Hello, all my friends in America. Hello, all you dear boobs who have been saying for a month past that I have gone dotty about Russia. We have rebuked her ungodliness, and now the sun shines on Russia as on a country with which God is well pleased, whilst his wrath is heavy on us, and we don't know where to turn for comfort or approval. We have prided ourselves on our mastery in big business and its solid foundations in a knowledge of human nature. And now we are bankrupt.
When Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office in March of '33, this country was on the verge of economic collapse. Trade with Russia would help pull us out of the Depression. But FDR had to convince a divided American public.
In Washington, former Senator Brookhart expects the Soviet to buy $520 million worth of goods. He believes Russia will take at least $50 million worth of raw cotton, which will help the South. Besides, he anticipates $30 million orders for textiles, which will benefit New England and Carolina mills, among others. Russia's major purchases, extended credit, are to be in heavy equipment, like machinery, which includes such items as tractors, motors, rails, and other materials, which the Soviet Union needs and which American mills are ready to produce. $400 million is to be expended in this way, according to Mr. Brookhart.
Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
17 days after FDR assumed office, he faced a major international crisis that made recognition of Russia even more important. Japan's resignation from the League of Nations worried Roosevelt. It seemed an ominous signal.
Most important of all was his anxiety at that time about the policies of the Japanese, his fear that they were going to go into China in a big way. They were already into Manchuria, and his belief that we might be able to cooperate with the Soviet government in putting up resistance to Japanese incursions into the Asian mainland. I think this was the most important thing.
Moscow, Roosevelt reasoned, might provide a buffer against Japanese aggression, but recognition was risky. Diplomatic recognition of the Soviet Union was a highly controversial issue in 1933. There was intense public debate, much confusion, a complex array of pros and cons. First, there was the ideological issue. Many Americans saw communism as godless. Recognition of the Soviet Union would be un-Christian as well as un-American. Therefore, the Catholic Church and patriotic groups opposed it.
Congressman Hamilton Fish of New York wanted to deport all communists as subversives.
There were between 500,000 and 600,000 communists in the United States, of which 2/3 were aliens.
Senator William Borah, the isolationist, favored recognition to develop trade. Congressman Martin Dies of Texas was obsessed with communist infiltration.
Mr. Martin, have the communists attempted to seize control of the labor movement?
Undoubtedly, the communists have sought to seize control of the American labor movement, but they have not succeeded.
American labor was against recognition, but because of the need for foreign trade during the Depression, farmers and business leaders were for it. So President Roosevelt's problem was this: how could he make recognition, which he saw as inevitable, palatable to the American people?
Roosevelt turned to an old friend and an expert on the Soviet Union, William Bullitt. FDR had appointed him special assistant to the Secretary of State.
Bullitt was a brilliant, well-born, well-educated man, a dilettante. To my knowledge, he had never really had a profession. He had lived around in Europe, a very amusing and stimulating man to be with.
The president met secretly with Bullitt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull to develop a recognition strategy. What evolved in the Oval Office was a plan for covertly encouraging discussion of recognition with Russian officials. Bullitt would bypass most State Department channels and report directly to the president. Bullitt's charade carried some disastrous possibilities. Public revelation would abort the plan. Bullitt's field of operation was the placid esplanade of Washington's Embassy Row. Under cover, he headed for 1637 Massachusetts Avenue, the Soviet Information Bureau, Russia's unofficial embassy in the United States. Bullitt made known to the Russians Roosevelt's desire to open negotiations. Maxim Litvinov was the man Bullitt believed critical to the success of the mission. Delicately worded secret cables invited Litvinov to America. Moscow approved.
What he did was to get Litvinov over here to discuss these matters and get Litvinov to sign up to a whole series of public statements which would serve to relieve the anxieties of these particular elements of American public opinion, from which he expected opposition. Characteristically, he got assurances which would look good to the American public, but which didn't mean a thing when it came to real dealings with the Russians.
Behind closed doors at the White House, Litvinov, Secretary of State Hull, Bullitt, and the President negotiated a series of agreements, then presented diplomatic recognition as an accomplished fact.
Yesterday's exchange of notes between President Roosevelt and myself opens a new page in the development of relations of real friendship and of peaceful collaboration between the two largest republics in the world.
And I believe sincerely that the most impelling motive that has lain behind the conversations which were successfully concluded yesterday between Russia and the United States was the desire of both countries for peace, the desire for the strengthening of the peaceful purpose of the civilized world.
Our expectations were soon disappointed. President Roosevelt had been somewhat of a cynic. He correctly calculated that the American people would be impressed and reassured by Soviet assurances. But as Professor George Kennan observed, FDR was interested only in their momentary psychological effect on the American public, not in their effectiveness in practice. The Soviet government subsequently refused to pay attention to most of those assurances. And trade, too, failed to increase after recognition, and never even achieved prior to World War II the level it had reached in 1930 when there were no relations at all. Roosevelt was right in believing that recognition had to come. It might have been better if it had come with less exalted hopes and expectations. As Professor Kennan said, it was perhaps inevitable that a country which had so long exaggerated the effects of withholding recognition should exaggerate the significance of granting it.
In the film 10 Days That Shook the World, director Sergei Eisenstein captured the spirit of a mass movement so crucial it affected every aspect of 20th century history, the Russian Revolution.
We're in the home of the late Mrs. Marjorie Meriwether Post, Hillwood in Washington. This is a cultural link with imperial czarist.
The Russian monarchy collapsed. The victory belonged to the proletariat, led by Bolshevism's prophet, Vladimir Lenin. And Russia became a land of untouchables to Americans.
For 16 long years, a nation larger even than ours in population and in extent of territory has been unable to speak officially with the United States or to maintain normal relations with us.
Russia, perhaps the finest collection of Russian art outside the Soviet Union. This chandelier came from the palace of Tsar Paul I, the son of Catherine the Great. That's her portrait behind me. The other portraits include the Tsars Nicholas I and II, and the last Tsarina Alexander. That was pre-revolutionary Russia before 1917. The United States did not recognize the new regime for 16 years.
In January 1917, Tsar Nicholas played the role of field commander to the army in spite of warnings of dangerous unrest throughout Russia. His army held the key to the...
American diplomatic recognition of the Soviet Union is a story of expediency at work in the field of foreign affairs. When Franklin Roosevelt assumed the presidency, his most urgent business was spurring life into the economy. Foreign trade was vital, Russia was a promising customer, so a deal was struck with what some would later call the devil.
They date their royal beginnings from the victory of Muscovy princes over Mongol tribesmen. They are the Romanovs, keepers of the royal treasures, the Tsars of Russia.